Welcome to the Neubauer Collegium's Director's Lecture. This evening, Professor Robert Shiller, Sterling Professor of Economics at Yale, and a Nobel laureate in economics, will give a lecture entitled Narrative Economics. Professor Schiller's work is of such distinction and wide interest that he could easily be speaking at any of a number of departments or research institutes on campus. But perhaps a word is in order on why he is an outstanding speaker for the Neubauer Collegium. The Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society exists to promote conversations and collaborations around issues so deep and complex that it is unlikely that any one perspective or area of expertise will be adequate to address them. We do not exist for the sake of interdisciplinary research per se, but rather to bring together people from any discipline, indeed from any domain of thinking and from any part of the world, to think through a problem wherever that thinking needs to go. And what unites these communities of inquiry is a concern with the human, with who we are as we best understand ourselves, and with issues and concern to us as human. For example, what are the best ways to preserve and present material cultures of the past? What is human health, and what are the best ways to promote it? How should we think about and respond to challenges of climate change? What is it for an environment to be sustainable? How are we to understand crime within human society, and what are ethical ways to respond to it? What is the significance of the humanities and social sciences? The humanities and social sciences are not simply different areas of inquiry. They are different postures of the mind. The social sciences demand scientific rigor, an approach to the human that understands rigor in terms of an objective stance, one that is testable, repeatable, and evidence-based. The humanities, by contrast, are essentially first-personal, singular and plural, in the sense that what is to be understood, the human, is itself shaped by the very understanding that is taking shape. The human world is shaped by literature, philosophy, history, and culture, not simply as external forces, but by the very understandings of literature, philosophy, history, and culture that constitute it. Now, this is not, I think, subjective. It's not a subjective as in contrast to the objective sciences. It's rather a realm of the human in which the concepts subjective and objective are not well suited to understand what is going on. The inquiries are also rigorous, but it's a different form of rigor. But how might these different postures of the mind, the humanities and the social sciences, come into fruitful conversation and possibly influence each other? Now, to me, this is a very obvious fact. Some of you may not know this, but I think very few. I am not an economist, and I make no claims to expertise. But when I read through Robert Schiller's books, I think this is a world Plato would recognize, as would Freud and Shakespeare, Tolstoy, and Proust. And in his book, Fishing for Fools, which is PH in both words, in Fishing for Fools, for example, Schiller and his co-author, George Akerlof, argue that a free market is efficient, not just in creating objects that satisfy our desires, but also in taking advantage of weak spots in our human constitution, temptations, seductions, wishes, many of them unconscious, that ought not to be thought of as what we really want. And he calls this the monkey on our back. And Schiller argues that there is such efficiency and inevitability in taking advantage of the monkey, or to use another of his expressions, of fishing us for fools, that we ought to consider this process as internal to the free market and not as a set of externalities. Now, Plato came to a similar conclusion modulo his time, and it shaped Socrates' critique of democracy as a political form. Republic's books 4, 8, 9, and 10 are, I think, now required reading for our times. For Socrates, rationality was not to be found thick on the ground amongst humans because it required both an accurate understanding of what it would be to live a happy life and a psychic capacity to organize one's psyche so that such an understanding harmoniously prevailed. Now, his investigation of human psychology led him to believe that appetites regularly distort our conceptions of human happiness. Now, this occurs, he thought, via the production of seductive narratives that distort reason's ability to distinguish tempting appearance from real happiness. Now, in this picture, it is less that there is a monkey on our back than that there is something monkey-ish within us. And if we add Darwin into the mix, the point is not that the monkey is on my back, but that I am a monkey's uncle. And what are we to do about this? I understand that Professor Shiller's work is controversial within economics, and controversy is often welcome within a discipline. But that is not the reason I invited him. It's not for the sake of controversy, nor is it a way of weighing in on one side or the other. I have invited him because he is a distinguished thinker within his discipline whose ideas and hunches reach out and challenge us throughout the humanities and social sciences. To pursue his thoughts, we would need not only to be economists, but we would need to think deeply about what rationality consists in, about the difference between real want and distorting temptation. What is it for human lives to be fulfilling? What are narratives, and what place do they have in human life? How is it best to think about the human psyche? What political formations foster human flourishing? In short, Robert Shiller's work lays down challenges within economics that radiate out to psychology and philosophy, history, literature, sociology, anthropology, and political thought. Now, as you probably all know, Robert Shiller won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2013, along with our very own Eugene Fama and Lars Hansen. He has taught at Yale since 1982. He is well known for 3 best-selling books, Irrational Exuberance, and then 2 co-authored books, Animal Spirits, How Human Psychology Drives the Economy and Why It Matters for Global Capitalism, and Fishing for Fools. He has written many important articles on market volatility and the creation of bubbles, and he is widely regarded as one of the most influential economists at work today. Now, on the occasion of winning the Nobel Prize, Shiller wrote an autobiography that is available on the website of the Swedish Academy, and I recommend that you read it. Especially poignant in his account is the account of his marriage. It's not just that his tribute to his wife, Ginny, is sincere and heartfelt. It is that she is an accomplished psychologist, and their conversations opened up his economic thinking to the world of psychology. The kinds of conversations we want to support in the Neubauer Collegium seem to be occurring within the Shiller household on a daily basis. Now, after Bob Shiller speaks, we shall have an open-ended conversation with him and John Levy, followed by questions and answers from the audience. Now, John is probably well known to most of you, but for those who don't know him, John is a professor of history here at the University of Chicago, and he specializes in the history of economics in the United States. And his book, The Ages of American Capitalism, is forthcoming from Random House. And John is currently a principal investigator in the Neubauer Collegium project, The Economy and Its Boundaries. But now, please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Shiller, who will speak to us today on the topic of narrative economics.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I'm honored to be invited to speak to the Neubauer Collegium. I have to say that all my life I've appreciated an integrative, cross-disciplinary approach, and that's what the Neubauer Collegium stands for. But I haven't been that much connected to the humanities. 25 years ago, Dick Thaler and I, he's a professor at Chicago, here, we set up a series of workshops at the National Bureau of Economic Research on what we call behavioral economics. So behavioral economics was economics with an input from the psychology department. And every department has its own toolkit for approaching research. We were very much psychology, maybe a little sociology, maybe a little anthropology, but it was all social science. Well, a little bit of humanities, but I'm starting now with my more recent work to think that we have to look at the humanities as well, history and literature, because the theme of my talk today is that you use the word humanistic and humanity. I'm not always sure that I knew what that meant, or what. There is something that it's difficult to formalize about human beings that we have to understand, I'm increasingly believing, if we're going to understand economic phenomena. So I want to talk today about something that I'm calling narrative economics, which is approaching it's not replacing economics, it's adding something to economics, which is a study of the narratives that, that people transmit. So what is a narrative? I'll kind of define it my own way. The human species, everywhere you go, is engaged in conversation. We are wired for that. If you look at any human society, you'll see people standing, facing each other, moving their lips. And what are they doing? Largely telling stories or narratives. And narratives then spread through contagion. It's from one person to another. There's an inventor of a narrative, and then the narrative spreads. It can disappear quickly, or it can last a long time. I think of a narrative as a gem, something that you heard somewhere, and you think, oh, I'll remember that. Next time I'm in a conversation, I'll use that. I'll say it, and I'll try to present it right, because I want to have the effect that it had on me. That's a narrative. Narratives can, the current word is go viral. That means they can have a contagious element from one person to another and then explode onto the national or international stage. I think this is understanding the virality of narratives is one of those large-scale questions that the Neubauer Collegium is interested in. It's interesting to look back. Whose idea was it that narratives or ideas can go viral? I think I've traced it back with the help of Joel Mokyr at Northwestern University to David Hume in the mid-1700s. So it was Hume who seemed to be the first that I found. Tell me if some of you know of an earlier statement. But they didn't even have a germ theory of disease yet, so it was in its beginnings. The really clear statement, I thought, was in Gustave Le Bon's 1895 book, The Crowd. This book is famous for coining the term crowd psychology. But he also used another term that never caught on, never went viral itself, and that was idea microbes. This is 1895. Now, why didn't he say virus? Because, as you must know, viruses weren't invented or discovered yet until, I think it was 1897. So nobody could say thought virus or... and then Richard Dawkins is credited with the term, you know the term meme, M-E-M-A, is a thought virus, an idea that is transmitted and can go viral. So I thought, this morning, I'm at my hotel, they give away newspapers, and I thought I have a good example of a narrative right here. I don't know if you can see this. Can you see this? It says Dow tops 200, I'm sorry, I forgot. Tops 20,000, okay? And now, first of all, I don't know if this needs any explanation. This is absolutely meaningless, all right? Because they started the Dow at 40 in 1896. Hey, but they could have started it at 50 or something else. So it's a joke. But they put it, and look at this diagram of the stock market. Woo! It's exciting. And then, in the second paragraph, they link it to another narrative, Donald J. Trump. Okay. Now, this is something that you are trained to do in journalism school. The Wall Street Journal is it's a great newspaper. I don't mean to be too tough on it here, but it's a little bit endangered. It was taken over by Rupert Murdoch, right, because it was in trouble, and they have to do this. You know, don't complain too much. It's part of what George Akerlof and I call a fishing equilibrium. Within limits, you've got to fish. You've got to play the game. Another thing that strikes me is it says, applause, whoops, and cheers erupted on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange as the market closed. Now, do you believe that? I mean, these guys aren't stupid, right? They know it's just a number that was made up. But then you have to reflect that, well, the whole floor of the New York Stock Exchange is just a trick, because we are into electronic trading now. Why do they even keep that? Well, they keep it because it's a narrative, right? People come to New York and they want to see the New York Stock Exchange. They want to see something. They have a visitors gallery. They take lots of pictures. But anyway, this is a distinguished newspaper that we depend on for our democracy to function well. Now I took the other newspaper at our hotel. It's called USA Today. Can you see that? So it says Dow at 20,000. Now what? And Dow 20,000, a long-time goal of Wall Street bulls that pessimists said was a pipe dream, is now etched into the record books as the biggest milestone ever achieved by the 120-year-old index. That's just so much baloney, right? I mean, and they bring in human interest. Now, this is really a story, this is a narrative about a number, this 20,000. But it's also a story about people, because they talked about these, the triumph of the bulls over the pessimists who said it was a pipe dream. This is what they teach you in journalism school, but you'd learn it yourself eventually if you ever wrote for a newspaper. You've got to bring in human interest. And so they're thrilled by it. But here's a picture. See this? You can't see it. It's too far away. But it's someone on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange with a big smile. Now, do you believe that? You know, he's not really thrilled by he knows there's a camera there, right? He's putting on an act. And they're all in this. This is telling a story. It's not evil. I'm just saying, do you really believe that with all this noise, this is what people are reading? Is anyone really studying the fundamentals this morning of the stock market and thinking about what level it should be at? So that's narrative economics. Now, maybe I'll go to my first slide here. The thing that occurs to me is that what I'm telling you is not new. I hope many of you kind of knew this all along. Narratives drive the world that we live in. But not everyone is equally proficient at understanding narratives. And I have to say that my own profession is one of the weaker ones in appreciating narratives. So I did some statistics to show this. I took JSTOR, which allows you to search scholarly journals, and I searched for the word narrative in articles in all of these fields. And I did it first for all dates. JSTOR goes way back to the beginnings of these journals. And then I also did it for the last 7 years, from 2010 to 2016. So what you see, I guess I can walk over here. Economics is the second worst. I say worst, but at least in finance is the one that really doesn't care about narratives. And I think that's backwards, because my view of financial markets is they're just tremendously influenced by narratives. Anthropology is big. History is really big. Now, you'd think that history is about narratives, right? It's almost like a synonym. But what a lot of historians don't appreciate is that you can't understand history unless you tell us what their stories were. What were their narratives? So I was influenced by Ramsey McMullen, who's a member of the Yale History Department, who wrote a book called Feelings in History. And he says historians could be more attentive to what people really thought. So for example, do you understand the Civil War in the 1860s? Horrible war. Why did they do it? They didn't like slavery in the North, but were they ready to lose 700,000 men over that issue? Well, somehow they were really emotional. He gives some of the stories that they told. And I got emotional too, hearing about abuse of slaves and things like that. So that's narrative history. It may seem especially relevant right now in the so-called post-truth world that we live in, that it's all narratives driving everything. The word post-truth, according to Oxford English Dictionaries, is new in the year 2016. So I think maybe it has gotten worse, but it's not necessarily new. There were a lot of narratives that were totally wrong that circulated all throughout much of our time. Can I say something about Donald Trump narrative without influencing anyone? Every storyteller has a certain background and understanding of how to tell a story. And so Donald Trump got expertise in narratives by some of the businesses he was involved with. First example is gambling casinos. And they have a theme. I don't even know. What does he have? Taj Mahal or something? I don't even know. I don't go to gambling casinos. But another thing is he's connected with fake wrestling. What do you call it? It's not. No, people don't want to say fake wrestling. It's the company World Wrestling Entertainment has the word entertainment in its name, which is a clue that it's a show. It's not a real wrestling match. And so he appeared on their videos or the TV show with Vince McMahon, and now he's appointed Mick Mahon's wife, or nominated her for Director of Small Business Administration. This has a certain form of narrative that appeals to a certain element of the population. Probably not most of you here. I don't know, I'm guessing. But they have clear delineations of good guys versus bad guys. They're braggarts, they're obnoxious. It's just apparently fun to watch. So he learned that trick. And then he had this TV show called The Apprentice, where a reality TV show where he was presented as a mentor, tough but a strong person. All these things shaped his campaign later, and there's just so much. He had so much practice and attention to what works in front of audiences that it seems not so surprising. I didn't predict it, but not so surprising that he won the presidency. And he's having economic effects. Really, if he cuts the corporate tax rate from 35% to 20, now he's saying less than 20, right? That should, in principle, it should really push up the stock market. And a lot of what we're trying to predict with financial markets is to predict that sort of thing, and that means we're trying to predict narratives. So it seems like it should be. I'm not the only person raising this. There's Morton Shapiro. He's the president of Northwestern University. He's coming out with a new book with a Russian language co-author. I mean, he's a language and literature person, Gary Morrison, called Sense and Sensibility, arguing that the economics profession should be more focused on what they call narrativeness. And Deirdre McCloskey has an article recently asking for, I forget what he called it, some kind of narrative economics. So maybe this is something of a movement. Now, narratives are part of, I said this before, but I want to just clarify. The human brain is built around narratives. It's not just, I feel good, I think a certain way because it feels good. No, it's because there's pathways built in. There is a structure to support narratives. It's the human species. And in fact, a number of people have proposed, I have a misplaced slide, but I'll say it now. Homo narrans was proposed as the name for the human species by Walter Fisher in the 1990s. We call us Homo sapiens, but maybe we're really not so. Sapiens means wise. Maybe we're more Homo storyteller. And then Stephen Jay Gould said we should be called Homo narrator. That's Latin also. The word narrator is a Latin word. And Ferrand and Wilde said Homo narrativus. I don't think they know about each other. They're getting Latin all different ways. We need a Latin scholar to name the human species. But I think the human species really is. Your mind is really built around narratives, especially human interest. That's why advertisers put little skits on. They don't tell you about the product. They just show somebody else doing some human action. Another bit of evidence about the human mind and narratives is dreams. Did you ever have a dream at night that involved no people, and it was just abstract, maybe moving triangles or equations? No, it's never like that. It's always a story, and a lot of people have an impulse to tell someone about it, but the story is kind of crazy. It just jumps from one thing to another. It doesn't... Now, the interesting thing is that the neuroscientist Edward Pace Schott has a new article out arguing that there's a certain kind of brain damage that causes confabulation. People who tell nonsense stories. It's because of brain damage, they can't help it. So he looked at the brain activity of some of these patients and found it similar to the brain activity in REM sleep when you're dreaming. So that's what it's just, there's other mental illnesses like schizophrenia where you hear voices, or autism is related also to narrative disruption. So I'm just saying, we really need to think about the human species as narrative-driven. So I wanted to move then to another department of the university. This has been such an odyssey for me, trying to follow up narratives. I feel almost, I think one reason economists don't do it is there's just so much to read about narrative, all different departments. And it's very difficult. So most scholars might retreat out of being intimidated by the vast literature. So now I wind up in the mathematical epidemiology department at the medical school. And we're talking about contagion of narratives. So this is the most famous original mathematical epidemic model written by Kermack and McKendrick 90 years ago. Mathematical epidemiology has come a long way. So, but this was the classic, as I understand it, original model. So what we do, we're going to have a fixed population. There's only n people in the population. And we're going to divide them into 3 compartments. Now we're talking disease here. This isn't economics. This is 1927, the med school, okay? Susceptibles, infectives, and recovereds. So the idea is this is a disease. Nobody dies from it, but they become immune from it. And they don't spread it anymore after they're recovered. And then we have, it's very simple, 3 equations. Susceptible is converted to an infective by catching the disease. And that's related to the contagion rate times the product of the number of susceptibles and infectives. Sorry, this is a math lecture all of a sudden. I sprung this on you, but I won't dwell on it too much. And then, so that's understandable, right? They're just not, they're no longer susceptible, they're infected. But the reason it's the product is because it only happens when a susceptible meets an infective. And so the product is a number of possible such meetings. And then we'll drop down to the 3rd equation. It says that recovereds are, the change, the derivative of recovereds is equal to the number of infectives times a recovery rate. That's just exponential decay of infection. And then this is the 3rd equation. Since they add the total number of all 3 sums to n, the sum of the derivative has to be 0, so this is the equation. If you didn't get all that, don't worry. All it says is that there's 2 parameters, contagion rate and recovery rate. And every disease has its own contagion rate. It might depend on conditions, weather or crowding or something, but this model takes the contagion rate as constant through time, and the recovery rate is constant through time. So what does it do for an epidemic? We're still in the world of the med school, but I'm going to apply this to thought viruses. So this is an example of the solution to those differential equations, where I start out with 1 infective introduced in 100 people. So this number of susceptibles starts at 100, number of infectives at 1, and the number of recovered is 0. And you can see that I'll just focus on the number of infectives. It rises, and then it falls in a hump-shaped curve that's, in this case, skewed to the right. Okay? And that's an epidemic. Now, the really neat thing about the Kermack and McKendrick model, I'm going to just show one more slide. Oh, oops, I'm out of order here. Maybe I don't. I thought I had the other. Yeah. I'll race through this thing. The epidemic size depends on C over R. The number of people who eventually get infected is R infinity, and that's a function of C over R. So big epidemics are epidemics with a high contagion rate relative to the recovery rate. Not absolute, high. If both recovery rate and if both C and R are high, then the epidemic will just move very fast, and it won't get necessarily big. So you can have, the bottom line is, if you didn't get any of this math, is that you can have fast epidemics that last 2 or 3 days when both C and R are high, and then they're over. Or you can have slow epidemics that take 100 years, and then they're over. And you can have epidemics that only end up infecting 5% of the population, or it can be 100% of the population. It all depends on those two parameters. So let me get back to, I'm going to give you an example of a thought virus epidemic. This is, let me jump ahead. This is the Laffer curve. I'll come back to this slide. Art Laffer was an economist who had lunch in 1974 with Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. These were powerful Washington people. And it was at the Two Continents restaurant, wonderful Washington restaurant, I guess. I've never been there. And while he was there, he drew this diagram on a napkin. What it is, on this axis is the tax rate, income tax rate, and on this axis is the revenue that the government collects from the taxes. And he said the tax rate could be anything from 0 to 100%. But if you put 100% tax on somebody, they're not going to work, right? If you're going to turn it all over to the government. And if you put a 0% tax rate, you're not going to get any revenue either. So there's two tax rates that give you zero revenue, 0 and 100. But if you pick, let's say, then the punchline of his story on that occasion in 1974 was, what if you wanted to raise this amount of revenue? There's two tax rates that will do it. There's this one, which is low, and it doesn't disincentivize people from working too much. Or this one with like 90%, and almost nobody works, but somebody does, and so you still collect the same amount of revenue. I don't know if I said that right. It's like telling a story or a joke, and I'm feeling a little, not doing my best job. But isn't that a neat punchline to a story? This, for someone who doesn't know any, you don't think it's neat. This made Art Laffer super famous. If you do a Google search on Laffer curve, it's big, and it's much bigger than Art Laffer. He's swamped by his own idea. Why did it get so big? Well, it was partly because this was I'll show you his epidemic curve. Now this is the actual counts, both for news and newspaper and for books, of references to the Laffer curve. 0, of course, until 1978, because that's when Jude Wanniski published an article describing just what I told you, the dinner at the Two Continents, the napkin, and it soared. It rose for years. This was the time when Reagan got elected and Thatcher got elected. It penetrated the US, the UK, didn't do so well in France. In fact, Francois Mitterrand, the first socialist president, got elected. So it wasn't contagious in France. I don't know why. It was there, but not contagious. So I think that's an epidemic. Art Laffer wrote a book about the Laffer curve later. You know, once you're famous for something, it creates opportunities. But he said he couldn't even remember the dinner when he first read about it in Jude Wanniski's book. This just shows another example of epidemic outcomes. Here I'm looking for books through Google Ngrams, and I'm looking for 4 major economic theories. I've got the ISL, maybe some of you don't know what these are, but they're famous theories in economics. ISLM model, that was published in 1937 by John Hicks. And then the multiplier accelerator model, that was published by Samuelson in 1939. And then the overlapping generations model, published by Samuelson again in 1958. And then the real business cycle by Kydland and Prescott in 1982. They're all hump-shaped, like the model. I didn't select these. Some of them go faster than others. Well, that's different contagion rates. So you can also look up people's names and do this. There was an article that someone else wrote about it, but I did it with a couple of names, and I was struck. One of the most viral of all people was Adam Smith, who wrote a book in 1776 called The Wealth of Nations. And he peaked in the 1880s, 100 years after the book. And he's been decaying for another 100 years, but slowly. And the other one was Karl Marx. Karl Marx, who died in the 1880s, I think. He didn't peak until the 1970s. But now he's been decaying for 40 years. But it's all, I think, I might be wrong to apply something as simple as the Kermack-McKendrick model to that, but it seems, so I'm sort of running out of time. I have a long paper I'm working on this, but economists like to talk about contagion, but they want it to be through something economic. So I mentioned already the, I'm jumping up here, I'm having trouble. Sorry, okay, here we are. So Paul Samuelson in 1939 gave a model called the multiplier accelerator model that had it created a hump-shaped pattern like we see with these epidemic curves, but it was all through, not through contagion, but it was a sort of contagion. That multiple rounds of expenditure, you economists will know what I'm talking about. I mean, if you can't, it was a contagion through economic channels. When you spend money, somebody else gets money, and then they spend money. But I think that this is only one, and this shows a hump-shaped pattern from Samuelson's 1939 paper. That was the. Now, why do narratives affect economic decision making? When we want to understand a recession or a depression, we have to understand why some people will stop spending, right? What causes a recession? People don't buy a new car, they don't buy a new house. Why would they not? What would make you not do it? I can't imagine anything. Now, you could say I won't do it because it's a recession, but that doesn't tell me why recessions start. I want to know why someone during a recessionary period started spending less. And it seems like it's related to narratives. Now, one of the most important narratives in our culture is the stock market crash of 1929. Everybody knows that, I think. It's a very long, it's one of those long, slow epidemics. And it's still having impact. I've been asking in a questionnaire survey of individual investors for people to give me the probability of a stock market crash like 1929 or 1987. Those are the two biggest crashes in US history. And I'm working with Will Getzman and Dasso Kim on analyzing data that I've been collecting for close to 30 years, and for both individual and institutional investors. So this is the average probability the respondents give of a crash. A 1929 style crash in the next 6 months. It's way exaggerated all the time. It's like 15 to 20%. Now, you know, we've only had 2 such crashes in over 100 years. So how come why would you give such a high probability? The other thing is that it was very low just before the financial crisis, just exact opposite. When it was about to do it, they were complacent. Well, I think there's a mechanism here. They started bidding up the price of stocks, and then it crashed. And then their probability, after it was over, then their probability went up. And so we find that people, the narrative about stock market crash is a narrative about a horrible thing that got 25% of the population unemployed. They were standing in bread lines. Then World War II came because people were so unhappy. It's a terrible story. But we've been worried about it all these times because the narrative isn't forgotten. There's so many other episodes that you could be talking about, but apparently the story doesn't work as well. Now I'm going to go to another. I want to go back to some of the biggest financial crises in U.S. or world history. How am I doing on time, by the way?
Just keep going.
Okay. You don't remember this because it was a big, big narrative, but I don't think anyone talks about it anymore. I'm talking about the 1920-21 depression. First of all, we wouldn't even call it a depression. They called it a depression. We reserved depression for that one big event, 1929 to 40 something. 1920-21 was a big drop in the economy. The consumer price index fell 16% in 1 year, from June of 20 to June 21. Wholesale price index fell 45% in 1 year. So why did it happen? You'd think that economists would know the answer, but I asked around, and there aren't many explanations. The explanation that I heard the most was Milton Friedman. I guess you know about him here. And Anna Jacobson Schwartz wrote a book called Monetary History of the United States. And they have a long and very detailed discussion of the 1920-21 crisis. But it seems to me that what they're saying is that the Fed caused it by raising interest rates by 1 percentage point in 1920. And they said it was a big mistake to do that. And Benjamin Strong, who was president of the New York Fed, was on a world cruise when they did that. He was absent. So Benjamin Strong wouldn't have let them do that. Now maybe I'm oversimplifying Friedman and Schwartz. And maybe they just thought they're writing a book about a monetary history of the United States. Why should they talk about anything else? I did a search. I mean, if you know of another story, James Grant wrote a book about this, but he didn't come up with any new explanation. So I thought, I'm just going to go back and read newspapers from 1920 and just pretend I was there. And just try to get as immersed as I could in how did it feel to be alive in 1920. So then I found some remarkable things. One of them is, and this is shown on this diagram, that they were really upset about profiteers. Okay? Now, this shows for news and newspapers in the dark line and for books in the lighter line, the counts. And profiteers got really big. It got up to 1/3 of 1% of all newspaper articles had the word profiteer in them. And then you see this looks again like the Kermack-McHenry curve, right? It's dying out. It seems to have sort of had a steady state. It's pretty low. Maybe you don't even know what profiteer means. It comes from the word privateer, which is a kind of pirate, which goes back hundreds of years. And then someone said, well, those guys who made money during World War I were so evil, I consider them pirates, so let's call them profiteers. And that became a new word and slogan. Oxford English Dictionary said it was coined in 1912. The epidemic started in the UK, which was earlier in the war than we were, spread to the United States, and peaked 2 years after the war in 1920. So why did it happen? I think it's called the affect heuristic by Paul Slovic. They were very upset by certain things that were happening. You might have trouble recalling because you weren't there, so you have no idea what was making them unhappy. But maybe you do. So, I won't ask for I think some of you are thinking, influenza epidemic. There was the 1918-19 influenza epidemic, which was horrible. It caused many times worse than World War I by some accounts. And it hit young people. They would catch it, and then 2 days later they were dead. So that's pretty upsetting. Another thing, it must have been upsetting. Another thing is the communist revolution in Russia, which had repercussions here. There was a bombing of the New York Stock Exchange. And then one story that I thought was really important, reading newspapers and just sort of trying to feel like I'm living in 1920. You know this story, I bet. I bet almost all of you know this story. It is the story of the communists taking Tsar Nicholas II and his family, lining them up, the whole family, and then bringing in a firing squad and executing them all together. You've heard that story, right? It's horrible. These were people that you knew because they were famous. They're a beautiful family, dignified. They were in the photo review section of your newspaper regularly. And then the communists then just shot them all. Maybe it was a publicity stunt. It really got attention. So you're feeling kind of edgy, you're kind of angry, and you might have lost someone in your family in the war. And now there are these companies, then there was a lot of inflation. These companies were making these big profits. So you know what people started doing? They were angry with the companies. They didn't like communists either. They weren't going to go to communism, but they boycotted buying a lot of things. So they started by boycotting all these companies that they thought were making obscene profits. And then that started a recession, and then prices started falling. And then they started worrying about prices falling, so they held off buying. Anyway, that's my answer, what was happening in 1920-21. So I want to move to the Great Depression. And in the Great Depression, what was the narrative? It was 1920, 21. Everyone thought it's going to happen again. And that's why President Hoover said that we'll be over soon. The 1920-21 recession ended quickly. Why did it end quickly? James Grant writes about it, but not convincingly to me. I think it ended because people were looking at price declines. Prices came down. There's so many things to tell you about. There's so many narratives, and they seem to be like a constellation of narratives around a common theme. But I want to get to the Great Depression. So why did we have the Great Depression? Well, Friedman and Schwartz, what I like about the book is they're there ready to tell you why everything happened. But it's always because of the Federal Reserve. Maybe oversimplify. So at least they have a story. So it's Benjamin Strong again, and he failed us again by dying in 1929. And so that was the end of that. What really big thing happened was 1929 stock market crash. Now this you can see is the newspaper count for the word crash. And again, it's scaled by the number of articles. The stock market crash of 1929 was really almost the first time that anyone had ever used the word stock market crash. They didn't talk about it. Well, the language changes, so maybe it's a little hard to do research on it. So I was going back. Now I'm trying to pretend like I was alive in 1929 and understand what. The first thing that struck me is that they started talking about stock market crash a little bit in 1926. That's for the first time. So what was going on? I think when I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, and my professor there, Shaw Livermore, History 322, Individualism versus Collectivism. I took that when I was 19 years old, and I've been thinking about it ever since. Because he assigned to us a book by Frederick Lewis Allen, written in 1931, called Only Yesterday, an informal history of the 1920s. But he was writing from 1931. And Frederick Lewis Allen said that the 1920s was a period of prosperity, sexual liberation. Women were now wearing short skirts, and they would go off without any male companion, and they'd go out drinking at bars. There was discomfort with this. There was also a lot of financial fraud. There was a sense of moral indignation, but you couldn't say it because it was not politically correct, to use Donald Trump's term. But they were kind of itchy. There's kind of this sense that there was something immoral about the 1920s. On 1929, right after the crash, the Sunday after the crash, I went and read sermons by ministers. They loved this crash. And it was the day of judgment arriving. And, so now Frederick Lewis Allen in his book said that there was a change in spirit and mentality in the Great Depression. That skirt lengths went down. This is not a joke. You've heard about the skirt length theory of the stock market. But it's really not a joke. Women in the 1930s felt repelled by the 1920s. Now, they didn't want to be part of that anymore. And they started going to church more regularly. And they didn't want to spend money because in the 1920s, the Great Gatsby era, they wanted to show off how upper class they were. But it became unfashionable in the 1930s to show off your wealth because there's other people. They know there's all these people unemployed. It's just not nice. And they wouldn't do it. So demand fell. And that's my story of the Great Depression. I can maybe go on more, but it's a narrative story. So now the interesting thing is, Great Depression as a phrase was not used very much in the Great Depression. Now you probably naively, and I don't mean to accuse you of naivete, but you most likely imagined that they had a name for it, the Great Depression. Well actually, there was a book written with the title, The Great Depression. But I used to think that meant that everyone was reading the book. But in fact, only economists read the book. And it wasn't, people didn't have a name for it. They just thought hard times, or they liked the word breadline, which we've almost forgotten. That was the line you'd stand in to get food in the Great Depression. But then the Great Depression started to grow in our culture. It was growing rather slowly and steadily. I used to think it was John Kenneth Galbraith's 1955 book, The Great Depression, the 1929, I forget the exact title. You have the exact title, what is it? The Crash of 1929. Well, it's somewhere in there. It really doesn't show on here. It's not John Kenneth Galbraith so much. It's everyone talking to their children about this horrible depression. And somehow it got legendized, and it was growing. Now books, Google Ngram stops in 2008. Unfortunately, it doesn't let me look at the crisis. But news and newspapers absolutely took off in the financial crisis of 2007. So that was the story. The story was scary, that we could be in another depression. All the banks are collapsed. It seemed to fit the story, the narrative of the Great Depression. The banks collapsing, unemployment rising, stock market crashing. So I guess I'm at the end of my show. Let me just say something at the end, just about, I'd like to know why it is that economists don't study narratives. Maybe it's because they have better things to do. This isn't the only thing. I've actually, last year I was president of the American Economic Association, and so I had to immerse myself. Economists do lots of different things, and it's really pretty wonderful what they do. However, they miss things, and one of the things they really miss is the big story, I think, behind many of our economic fluctuations. So why do they miss them? Well, one of them is that they have a toolkit. We do simultaneous equations, general equilibrium. Those are, and by the time we finish teaching those, we're tired, and we don't. And we view this as somebody else's territory. That's another department. And so maybe that is, but I think that there is room for economists to do research on narrative economics. Now that we have all these databases, we can search for narrative. We can do quantitative analysis. Now, I don't think it's very easy to study the very human phenomenon of narratives. We could make mistakes. But I think it might require collaboration with people in the humanities. People like literary theorists who try to understand why some stories, structures work and others don't. Why they have their times and other times they don't work. So I think that, as I've said, narrative economics is already growing. And I'm optimistic that in the next, these things all take time. In the next 10, 20 years, we'll have a better understanding of economic fluctuations. So maybe I'll stop there. Thank you.
So now we'll have a conversation with Robert Shiller and John Levy, and then we'll have questions and answers from the audience.
Okay, good evening. So thank you for coming to Chicago. So as a historian, I agree with you. There are just so many narratives. And it seems to me that one of the challenges is choosing a narrative, choosing an analytical narrative with which to make sense of those narratives or to prioritize them. So I wanted to start by asking you a question about economics as a narrative and why you became the kind of economist that you are. Many economists make some pretty restrictive assumptions about human motivation, human behavior. People are self-interested, they're rational. And it seems like in the late 80s you started doing something that...
I got married to a psychologist.
Okay. Is that the end? I mean, you actually started to do surveys and listen to what people were saying.
Yeah.
Why the reasons they gave for why they acted the way that they did. Why did you want to do that?
Well, you're pointing out something that I do that's quite unusual. I do my own questionnaire surveys.
Yeah.
Why don't some economists do it? I'm not alone, but it's not common. It's also the kind of thing that I thought wouldn't benefit my career. So, for example, on that October 19th, 1987 stock market crash, I stayed up all night that night preparing a questionnaire survey. I wanted to find out what were people thinking on the day of the crash. And I thought this is a historic, this is the biggest stock market crash ever. And then I never submitted it to a journal because I just thought it would get rejected. Now maybe I was overly, I put it in the last chapter on a book that I wrote. But I don't know, why did I do that? I already had tenure, and I just didn't care. And the other question that it still puzzles me, why didn't anyone else do it? I don't know. In 1987, the Brady Commission, appointed by the president, did do a survey 3 months later. That's too late. I think people don't remember what they were. Why is it?
I like the answer. Tenure is a good thing, so we should keep it.
Well, I'm in support of tenure also. But that's a good point, because if you're too afraid of consequences, after a while you just get an idea that I just want to do something that's interesting to me.
So you mentioned post-truth, and I don't want to accuse you of being post-truth, but I want to ask a question about how far we can take narratives as explanations. So one reaction I would think, I'm not an economist, but I would imagine I would have if I was an economist, is what about the fundamentals? What about supply and demand? What about larger economic forces? Is this something acting in dialogue with?
Right, well, there's a whole, I mentioned real business cycle theory. So real business cycle theory, set up by Kydland and Prescott and many others, was a kind of fad for a while, and it still exists, but it assumes that the only thing driving the economy is technological change. Yeah. And it has a model of technological change as exogenous discovery. The scientist is working in his lab and he spills something, and then he realizes there's something here. So it's just completely random. In fact, I don't think technological progress is like that. So Joel Mokir's book, The Culture of Growth, which just came out, argues that the reason why we're so much better off now than we were 300 years ago is because our culture has changed, not because of randomly arriving inventions. So I guess we're still in a primitive stage in understanding macro fluctuations. If we can have a controversy as basic as that, if we can have a school of thought which says there's no role for anything except technology, and I'm taking the other extreme.
It was fascinating to hear accounts of these historical depressions and the kind of narratives that were underlying them, and I was struck by how many of those narratives seem to be moral narratives, seem to be about morality. Does that hold across, or?
I really believe that it's not mentioned enough by economists. Another really good example, which you may well remember, is September 11, 2001. That's the World Trade Center and the Pentagon bombing. And you may remember that President George W. Bush got on television and said, "Don't let those terrorists deter you from leading a normal life, because that's what they wanted. That's what they were trying to disrupt us." And you know what? We were already in recession when the terrorists struck, and we came out of it right at that point. I suspect, I don't know how to prove this, tell me if there's any way I can prove this, that it was people heeding that. And I hear people saying things like that. I'm not going to let this scare me. And so that's a moral decision. That's why I like to look at sermons. Economists never read sermons. But I shouldn't say it.
They give the sermons.
They give the sermons.
Yeah. Let's talk about Trump.
Okay.
I tried to hold off as long as I could. The question I have, I suppose, and it relates to the larger kind of idea of narrative economics, is which narratives succeed? And does the sort of propagation, and you gave the kind of epidemiological account of the kind of resemblance of these thought viruses, as you put it. But how can we start to think about which thoughts become viruses and which don't? You mentioned Adam Smith. Adam Smith in the 1880s, I didn't know that. If I had to guess, it's because of sort of debates about free trade and protectionism that were occurring at that time, and so Smith's ideas were appropriated.
It's also a very well-written book.
So why does Trump's economic narrative, why do you think it's so? Clearly he's a promoter. He comes from he has particular skills which we would think would lead him to be able to propagate his ideas very effectively. But nevertheless, why his kind of nationalism, his populism, why is that succeeding right now, do you think?
Well, I have to say I didn't predict his election. Although we gave a lot of money to Hillary just too late. We started to worry 2 weeks before the election, my wife and I. So I didn't, but you know, these are somewhat random. That I was just talking with Jonathan Lear about the number of musical groups that have only one hit. So there's just something clicks, and there's something in the human brain that responds to certain songs. I don't think we understand that. And who does? Someone in the room who understands it can tell me.
I don't think I do, but I think that the idea of "Make America Great Again." I mean, remember he gave a speech, a campaign speech. I think it was in Pennsylvania, and he got up and said, "We're going to bring the steel factories back." I don't think anyone there believed that he would actually do that. So it seems to be a kind of fantasy. That seems to be part of it. So I'm curious how fantasies might play into these kinds of narratives. And then second, it seems to be a kind of nostalgia. And actually the entire campaign, I mean, Sanders had a kind of nostalgia for post-war social democracy. Hillary had I thought, a kind of nostalgia for a kind of 1990s globalism. So it seems to be we're at a moment now where we're stuck on the past, perhaps.
Well, I'm not an expert on Donald Trump. It seems to me a good part of it is his maligning of Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. And he used this tactic that he learned from World Wrestling Entertainment, name-calling. Mm-hmm. So he called her Crooked Hillary. Mm-hmm. And then there was little Marco Rubio, remember that? And another thing about Trump, he's fun to watch. You probably agree. He's fun to watch. He just makes your day. You know, you read of his antics. He did some ridiculous tweet today, and he gets people talking. And again, it's his particular way of doing this, that at this moment in history, I think partly at this moment in history, people are annoyed by political correctness. And there are and he was at times unusually truthful. I think he did it. So for example, during one of the debates, it came out that he had donated to Hillary Clinton's campaign. Mm-hmm. And then he was asked about that. Mm-hmm. And if I remember correctly, he said, I did that. Everyone does. I'm a businessman. Mm-hmm. And I get a payoff from that. How could he be so candid? Mm-hmm. And then someone asked, what was the payoff? And he said, I got invited to Chelsea's wedding. Now, I was thinking for a moment, well, why is that such a payoff? But then I thought, of course that's a huge payoff, because he's always going for prestige and visibility. Mm-hmm. And so being at her wedding, he'll be photographed there. Mm-hmm. He doesn't care, I think, so much about money. He wants to be the big, important mm-hmm. guy. So I started to understand he was actually truthful at that moment. Mm-hmm. And in a time when the other men were all looking bland, and he was fun to watch.
You wrote a famous book called Irrational Exuberance.
I did.
Yeah, you did. And then, and then the stock market tanked. And then you brought out another edition in, I think, 2005 that said there was a housing market bubble, and then the housing market tanked. Do you think there's a kind of irrational exuberance in financial markets now? I mean, I think about the bond market, which many people are thinking of being...
Oh, now? You're asking
right now, yeah. I mean, because when you think
yeah.
about Trump and the kind of politics of fear and the politics of anxiety...
Well, you have to read those newspapers I just
Exactly.
showed you.
So now we have Dow 20... Do you see a kind of exuberance back in financial markets being brought about by his election?
Maybe. Yeah. But I'm not advising you to buy now. Maybe. The other thing that was on the USA Today this morning saying house flipping is back. So house flipping is buying a house and selling it 6 months later at a big profit. And that apparently, it's my impression too that it's coming back. So yeah, it could happen again. We could have another big boom. It would be the Clinton boom, like the Coolidge boom. I didn't mention Coolidge in 1920s. Coolidge was kind of like Trump in some ways, in that President Calvin Coolidge, in that Coolidge was pro-business. He said the chief business of America is business. And he appointed Andrew Mellon, Secretary of Treasury, who was one of the richest men in America, founder of the Mellon Bank. So you knew in the 1920s, we have a pro-business Republican government that wants us to do well. He's not going to regulate us or tax us. It's exactly the same thing that we have now. So we could have, I see it as a plausible scenario that we could have another 1920s. And maybe it will end in what will be 2019 or 2020. I don't know. It could end badly.
It's true that leading up to the vote in Brexit, there was a lot of fears that if Brexit happened, there'd be a kind of economic disaster. It hasn't taken place yet, at least not in financial markets. And similarly with Trump, if he was elected, there would be some kind of meltdown. And actually the opposite has occurred. So I'm kind of wondering if a kind of nationalist or anti-globalist narrative might be behind actually some of the movements we're seeing in financial markets. And I wouldn't like to think so myself, but might be having
Well,
success.
I think it's also a fading of the World War II narratives. So there was always patriotic Frenchmen and Englishmen and Germans, but they were so ashamed of what happened back then. But now they just don't remember it. That's the simple forgetting.
Yeah, that was a fascinating aspect of how memory of past economic moments feeds back into the present and shapes the future. I wanted to ask you a question, because I know we have an undergraduate class here that I spoke to a few weeks ago that's economics class on inequality. And inequality is a really important issue, political debate, but also economic debate. I just wonder if narrative economics might help us think through this issue.
Right. I think inequality is a huge issue, and it's going to be a big issue in the future because of technological progress. Now, Donald Trump was aware, he's a sensitive person, he's aware of what bothers people. So being laid off when you're 40 and then looking around for a job, and you get the impression, I'll never get a job like I had before. That creates a lot of anxiety. But I don't think Trump wanted the Hillary Clinton narrative, which is we'll tax the rich and support you, because it wasn't inspirational. He had a different legacy. On Apprentice, the TV show, he showed young people how to get rich. He wrote a book with the title, actually he didn't write it, Meredith McIver wrote it, but it has his name on it as if he wrote it. But actually I'll give Meredith McIver credit. She did make it sound like Donald Trump, and it does exemplify his candid explanation of his philosophy of life, which is, I'm quoting Meredith, think big, live large. You want to have big bashes, champagne receptions, gold-plated, or not gold-plated, solid gold things. And in the long run, it'll make you famous and successful.
Thinking about these issues and how economics might incorporate them in the next, I think you mentioned 10, 20 years, how much of this kind of behavior, when we think about emotions or anxiety, can be expressed in math?
Oh, in math?
In math, yeah. Can you model it?
Well, there's also recently a lot of talk by people who think there's too much math in economics. I don't like, just as there are people who say there's too much regulation. I don't think these are things you can quantify. It's a question of how applicable is it. And I actually think there's a lot of really nice, I went into economics initially because I liked math. And I think there's a lot of nice mathematical economics. And there's a lot of bad humanistic social science too, I'm sure. So I'm not making any blanket statement here.
Well, first, John, thank you very much. And we're open for questions. I'll call, and if you wait to get a microphone, somebody will bring it to you. Yes, please. Yeah.
Professor Shiller, I think this was your website, but you have a website dedicated to your Shiller PE. And I noticed that the PE was roughly 2 points below Black Tuesday in 1929. Is this have predictive ability?
Yeah. Well, I just rechecked it's about almost, my CAPE ratio is almost 29. And that's well above what it was in 2007. And it's getting closer to what it was in 1929. But it's not as high as it was in 2000, the beginning of 2000, when it was over 45. So this thing seems to predict the stock. It has historically.
This is PE. We should say this is price to earnings.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The price to earnings ratio. Yeah.
The earnings are a measure of the profits, how much money the company is making, and it's a long history of looking at the price divided by earnings, and it should be something like 15 or 12 or something. But when it gets up to close to 20, people think it's too high. So we're up to 28 right now. So what it suggests to me is that there's some irrational exuberance. But I don't like to give advice on because I think it might really go up and then come crashing down. I just don't know where it's going. But I guess what I'm saying is if you're retired and you're living off of your stock market investments, I wouldn't do massive margin purchases right now.
going to get him. Here's the mic. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Shiller. My name is Dan Lappin. I'm an alumni of the college with a degree in economics. So my question is, given the pervasive magnitude of narratives, Deidre McCloskey's been talking about this for a couple decades and has been formulating, and this describes real events in the economy. I'm wondering, is there a gap in our macroeconomic theory that we don't have a placeholder to describe this factor of production? And so I'm curious if I can go on a little bit. So if we think about if monetary policy is, money as a communication transaction tool and products tell stories, is there an opportunity to formalize the concept of communication and narrative within basic principles so that we have this formalized in not, where mathematical equations meet human language in a sense. So kind of give that sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a grand objective. And I imagine it can be somewhat formalized. Now, I think you mentioned monetary policy. Monetary policy has already been informally shaped by an intuitive appreciation of narrative. So when the financial crisis occurred, Ben Bernanke, who was chairman of the Fed, I believe, reacted to it from the broad depth of his knowledge about the Great Depression and not wanting that to happen again. So even though he didn't formally say anything about narratives, I think it must have been on his mind. And another example is when Northern Rock, there was a bank in the UK, had a run. In other words, depositors were afraid that it was going to fail, so they were all showing up and trying to take their money out. And if everyone does that, the bank will certainly fail. So they didn't have full deposit insurance in the UK. So the Bank of England just said, we'll bail it out. We won't let this bank fail. They did that quickly. Why did they do it? I think intuitively, I guess it was Mervyn King, knew that the UK had not had a bank run since 1866, and the public just was not worried about bank runs. He didn't want one now. And so even though it defied all standards of justice, he just bailed them out. And that was an important decision, based, I think, on, we have a common sense view when we see history happening of the importance of narrative. But how to formalize this, I think it's not impossible, at least partially to formalize it. But we're not there yet.
There's a question right there.
Thank you so much. I will stand here. My name is Pablo from Social Thought. My question is related to formalization and...
Speak a little slower. And
yes.
Thanks.
My question is related to a prior one about formalization. How, if you can elaborate a little bit more in the link between the narrative and behavior, decision-making, if this goes through expectations. And then I have a second one, very short. In your method about describing narrative...
You're hard to understand.
Okay.
Narratives and behavior.
But it's about narrative and behavioral.
Yes, how can you use narratives to explain behavior in a formal way?
Yeah, no, it seems like the word behavioral economics has usually referred to psych department, whereas narrative economics, maybe it's more anthropological or something.
But in terms of decision-making and expectations, if narratives shape expectations or change the payoffs of decisions?
Yeah, no, economists like the word expectations. It goes back to Irving Fisher in the 1930s, who developed formal models of expectations. The problem is that maybe that was not quantifying human behavior right. George Katona at the University of Michigan in the 1950s was doing surveys that led to the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index. And he initially asked people, what is the expected inflation rate for you? And what is the GDP growth rate? And after doing that for a while, he wrote in his 1975 book, Psychological Economics, that, you know what? They were just making up answers. They wasn't their expectation. They don't know. And so it seems like we want to move to something where we have to measure things in terms that are consistent with the phenomenon. And what people have is not an expectation. They might say some number that they saw somewhere, but they don't necessarily even believe it. Pollsters have problems getting true elicitation of true beliefs. But one thing you can learn more is by asking people to tell stories. And then if they're telling a 1929 story, that's just cause to be worried.
Here, there's a question here, please.
Thank you. So you discussed Trump sometime. My question is, can Trump ruin United States generally?
Can I?
Can Trump?
Ruin.
Oh, present.
Ruin United States
Oh, can
as a
Trump
country.
ruin-
Yes, as a country, not only economy because it's part, but generally.
Well, I'm not a Trump supporter, but I don't like to be too negative. He hasn't called me yet for advice, but if he does, I'll probably try to help him. What's that?
Tell him not to ruin United States.
I hope, yeah.
Next time he
What
calls
he's
me.
threatening to do is create a trade war. But actually, I said this at the World Economic Forum. We had a discussion group on Trump there, and nobody brought up. I thought the worst thing he's done is to bring up the idea of improving our nuclear arsenal, and then also saying that it wouldn't be a bad thing if Japan and South Korea and other countries got nuclear weapons. That is really bad, I think. What was he thinking? Because he's starting, what the whole point to me is that it starts a different psychology. And then people think everyone has to have atomic bombs. I thought we'd figured that out, that we don't, we try to calm everything down. And so that is the worst thing, the worst thing. And it was in the news this morning that the atomic clock had been moved forward to, what was it, 2.5 minutes before midnight because of Trump. It could be really bad if he gets a nuclear arm race going again.
Do you have a question there?
Yes. Industrial collapse, by the way, was the term used at the beginning of the Great Depression before the term depression.
Yeah.
What I want to get back to is the question about the narrative question that the previous questioner asked. Because I'm wondering if people are using the narrative form in a form of microhistoria to explain the individual and household decisions and the thought process behind them that affect major economic developments. And I'm thinking in terms of the decline of the middle class in this country. And it's hard for me to believe that a good part of it isn't due to the fact that the actual appeal and valuation of traditional middle class work has declined in this country compared with entrepreneurialism and brilliant developments in various fields and creative fields. So what I'm wondering is are people looking at writing this from an individual point of view, taking testimony and histories of individual families, looking at their thought processes on how educational decisions are made and how career planning is done, for example?
Are you asking, are people doing this?
Yes,
I
are
don't know
people
what
doing it?
people, I've tried it. I'm struck, when you search on Google Scholar for narrative, you come up with so many things. So I hope some people are doing that. Now, one thing that is very striking to me about the current narrative is that it's negative on the intellectual elite, and it's negative about our universities. And that is a worrisome, it's not I assume the present company are not negative about universities, but this middle class that you talk about that is disaffected, they think of conspiracies, that the universities are run by communists. It's an unfortunate turn of things, which empowers Donald Trump, who is willing to throw the bums out, and not...
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the individual decision-making processes, the cultural feelings toward middle-class work that a lot of middle-class families no longer have an affection for.
like for example, what?
Well, like, take engineering or drafting or computer programming or all these kind of jobs that where there are millions of openings, more than there are people qualified to fill them. There are not many more people getting degrees in computer science today than was the case 30 years ago. And it's especially true of the native-born middle class or people who used to belong to the middle class. There's just not a valuation in those kind of careers. People want to strike it rich. People want to, develop a startup and go from zero to $1 billion in valuation, or be a creative, maestro or whatever. But these middle-class jobs, the respectable middle-class jobs, they go begging.
Okay, I'm not quantitative. I don't know what to say. I have some impression that what you say is right, but maybe...
Well, go ahead. Do you want to say something, John?
It is a narrative that I suppose... Some people say that too many people are going into finance or business. That's what you're saying in the U.S. today, and not enough into the sciences. Is that...
It's a productive and competitive economy. It's a matter of people not going into infrastructure maintenance, the electrical grid, all these non-glamorous jobs, really. So it's not just a matter of STEM, but STEM is part of it.
Well,
I'm going to take the liberty of asking the last question. So you've spent your life doing economics, and you've spent your life teaching at a major research university. And the work you've done in economics has led you to sort of, there's something internal that makes you want to push out and explore something, namely narratives that, what would you say, but it's a field that you haven't really been given a lot of, training in, given the structure of education, and that you received and that is being passed on. And I wondered if in a lifetime of teaching at a great university and also doing research within the context of a university, what would you suggest for structural changes in the way we teach and the way we...
I think it's academia is pushing us toward, the rules of the game are pushing us to specialized research at the frontier, which is good in many ways, but it also has us lose the grip on the... I think we should be talking to people of different disciplines. So I was going to, again, congratulate the Neubauer Collegium for doing that
Leading
sort of
question.
thing. But do I have any other solutions? I think it's always... I think academia is in actually fairly good shape compared to what it was. If you look 100 or 200 years ago, they were finishing schools for rich boys and pathways to becoming a minister in a church, which is okay, but it's not. We do so much more. We're actually much better off. I actually like the life as a professor, even if I am sometimes pressured toward directions I don't always like. Another thing is I think that the world is really going to change with the advent of new computer technology. Already, I have an online course. You can take my financial markets course on Coursera for free if you want. I'm wondering where we're going with artificial intelligence and how we'll all fit in. We have to discover that. I think maybe we'll become a more human society in reaction to all these machines. Maybe at the university our class sizes will fall. We'll have more teachers, much more teachers, and we'll have much more relations with our students. Maybe that will change the environment. Heart-to-heart talks with your faculty advisor may help. But you're getting me on, this is not my expertise.
Yeah, I wanted to know what you thought. I think it's time to thank Robert Shiller for a wonderful talk and a wonderful evening.
Thank you.